Wrestling fans, promoters, wrestlers, and anyone who enjoys pro wrestling now have something new to be excited about. The Wrestling Fans International Association, the WFIA, is back. WFIA is an association that exists to promote, grow, and support professional wrestling throughout the world. Membership is free. Your membership includes a free digital bi-monthly publication of the Wrestling Fan News newsletter, association updates, voting privileges, and much more. Please go to thewfia.org, that's THEWFIA.org, and become a member today. Welcome to another edition of Bumps and Thumps, the talk of wrestling. I'm Brian Ferguson. My guest today, he doesn't need an introduction. He's a well-known historian, well-known throughout the wrestling world, both in pro and at all the organizations and conventions we have around the country. My good friend, been on here time and time again. Appreciate it. My good friend, George Schire. Thank you for coming on today.
Hey, we're talking wrestling, so it's got to be fun, right?
Always fun. And I want to talk about a particular wrestler, to me, George, that doesn't get the recognition I feel, and I'm sure you do too, that he deserves. There's others, but this one in particular today is Nick Bockwinkel. Nick Bockwinkel, in my mind, one of the top 5 all time, without question, in my mind. Maybe younger people, 40 and under, probably don't even know who the guy is, unfortunately.
Well, that's true of a lot of wrestlers.
I mean, of
40,
the
yes.
under 40 don't know a lot of the wrestlers unless you hear, Hogan behind me there, Flair, guys. But one in particular is Nick Bockwinkel. And I want to talk about him today if we could. And I want to start out with his background. And I know you're very familiar with Nick. You were friends with Nick. You were close with him. He's been in your home. Tell us a little bit about his background, growing up and getting into the business and things of that nature, if you would.
Did you ever wonder what could have been with the AWA had things gone differently? Had their fortunes gone differently? Had certain wrestlers not left and perhaps more money would have been at the disposal of the Gagnes? Well, wonder no further. You can go to Brad Drake's YouTube channel and experience the 1987 Supermod for yourself, as Brad Drake starts off in May 1987, along with Greg Gagne, Baron Von Raschke, Vern Gagne himself, Nick Bockwinkel, Larry Zbyszko, Kurt Hennig, and a slew of others as he plays and saves the AWA.
Please.
Well, the thing about Nick, and you're right, Brian, he doesn't, I don't think he gets the accolades that he deserves. That age 40 and over that you speak of, you can't blame them for not wanting to know about history. They're involved and enthralled with their current product and the business as it is. And we always have to give them their credit for enjoying wrestling for the way it is today. But the old codger like me, and I'm a lot older than you are. So I applaud people like you. I do. I sincerely do. Because you are among it's really a small group of people that really care about wrestling's storied past, learning about the guys, the pioneers that, they set the bar very high for a lot of the stars today. The one thing that I would always just give young talent some advice on is, if you really want to learn your craft, if you really want to get better at what you do and become great at what you do, go out there for what limited videos there are available and look at the Nick Bockwinkels and the Vern Gagnes and the Harley Races and all of the others. Look at their videos. Pay attention to them. Watch what they do. Watch how they walk. Watch how they strut. Watch how they talk. Watch how they get a reaction from the crowd. Watch how they get the crowd to go for them or against them. If our young wrestlers today would not discount what these guys brought to the business, and in the forefront, you're right, Nick Bockwinkel, absolutely one of the best. With that said, I want to sum it up very quickly by just saying this is me. My morning coffee is in here, and
I love it.
on the back we've got the silhouette of Nick wearing that infamous
inmate
belt.
Yes,
the
inmate belt.
Yes.
So,
but here's the deal with Nick. This is a guy who literally grew up around the business, being that his dad, and you talk about somebody who doesn't get credit because he wasn't a big national world champion of his era, but we're talking Warren Bockwinkel, Nicky's dad. Yeah. But Warren Bockwinkel, let's just start with that. He was a guy who was very respected in his era, in the 40s, in the early 50s, even a little bit of the later 30s. Warren was extremely respected. And he was respected, Brian, because he was first and foremost a wrestler. Warren Bockwinkel didn't have a gimmick. He didn't have any fancy uniforms, any fancy jackets, ring attire, haircuts, fancy boots. He just wrestled. And he was in an era when guys like Lou Thez were in the business. And Warren did it the right way. He just traveled, went around. He earned respect from fans by doing that wrestling. He was a good guy. Or he could be the bad guy if he wanted to be. He was just one of those guys that, depending on the opponent. And that takes a special skill. Sometimes the tweeners, as we were calling them back in the day, are some of your best workers. So Warren was around the business, hung out with Lou Thez, and little Nick, he's having the chance at the younger age to be around the wrestling business. You can't help but think that some of that soaked in. And Nick told me a few times, he said, he'd have the chance to maybe be around his dad, and he just observed. Nick paid attention. It was important for him to just watch. He didn't interrupt. He didn't, interfere with what was going on. But he learned. And it was his dad, Warren. It was Lou Thez, and a guy by the name of Wilbur Snyder, who were the primary trainers for what would later become Nick Bockwinkel as we knew him.
Yeah.
Wilbur Snyder was about 10 years older than Nick, truly about a decade older. Ironically, they kind of resembled each other in their younger years. They both had the crew cut in their day and basically the same type of build. And they even formed a tremendous tag team after Nick got into the business. In the very early 60s, Nick and Wilbur were California version world tag team champions. They held the Indianapolis version of the tag team title together. But Wilbur was a very big influence on Nick. One great story when we talk about it, this comes to me as I talk, that. Nick told the story about he had the distinction of sitting on the lap of Lou Thez as a baby almost, still a baby. And Nick says that he wet his pants right on Lou Thez. So he holds that distinction that on the great world champion Lou Thez, Nick says, I peed on him. And only the way Nick could share it. He had, anybody that knew Nick Bockwinkel knows that he had such I guess I'd call it a dry sense of humor. He had a smirk that he could put on his face, and he could throw something in there and it just got you. He just had a way of doing that. And he just had a personality that I think eventually just was wrestling in general. So his basic start in the business, and his first match was in 1954. Okay. So Nick would have been about 18 years old, give or take. He was born in, actually, he would have been almost 20. I take that back. He was born in 1934. Okay. But Nick had wrestled a little bit off and on, dabbling in it, but officially his pro matches kind of started around 1954. And he had been to college. He wanted to be a football player, but his knees had banged up knees and he couldn't do that. And so football wasn't it, but he was at Oklahoma for his college years and just begged his dad to help him out, to train him, and Lou, of course, and Wilbur was there, being a close family friend, and so it all came together.
Wow. Yeah, I read some stuff on Nick about going out to California. I believe he went to UCLA for a little while to finish up his degree, and then had to do some matches actually out there to pay for his college. And then he was in the service, is that correct?
He was. And that's an interesting thing because he was, while he was in the Army, he was stationed at Fort Ord, O-R-D. And it was forbidden in those days, probably still is today, I don't know, but it was forbidden that the guys would go off base and do something, especially like wrestling. But Nick would go off base and he would wrestle, but he did not wrestle as Nick Bockwinkel. His earliest results, you will see names like Nick Warren or Dick Warren. And Warren, of course, he was using his daddy's name. Yeah. But Nick Warren. And it was interesting because Nick said one time that one of the sergeants or something in the camp, he says, you know, you kind of look like that guy that wrestled the other night. And of course, Nick, you know, he couldn't admit it or anything. But yeah, he did. There are some early results with him. He even held a tag team title as Dick Warren. He teamed up with who was then still a young wrestler, Ramon Torres. And they actually won a version of the NWA World Tag Team title at the time. You know, I say version because just always letting fans know that the NWA, the National Wrestling Alliance, never officially recognized any tag team as the official NWA World Tag Team Champions. They only recognized the World Heavyweight title and the Junior Heavyweight Championship. Those were the only two titles for the NWA. But if you go around the country in those days, all the different territories that were under the NWA umbrella, they all had their own version of the NWA World Tag Team Champions. So there were hundreds of them. I mean, so Nick and Ramon Torres actually held a version of the title.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Now I've seen a story, and this is where I need you to confirm the historical fact. When Nick got to the AWA in 1970, I believe it was, around 1970.
December 10th.
You even got, okay.
December 10th, 1970, that was his first appearance on All-Star Wrestling TV.
So he came in there and wrestled and already had credentials as far as being in other territories. You know, Vern brought him in. My question is to you, was he supposed to get the heavyweight title earlier than 75? I have read where he was going to be the champion in 72 or 3 around that time. The reason why they delayed it is when Hercules Cortez was killed in a car wreck, and they wanted to team him with Ray Stevens to get the tag team titles from Bastien and I believe it was Crusher then. I'm not quite can't remember, but is that accurate or is that a false? Hey everyone, this is Brian Ferguson. Fans of the AWA, you are in for a real treat. My friend Joyce Poston has just released her book titled My Ringside Seat to the AWA. Joyce writes about her personal experiences with wrestlers such as Nick Bockwinkel, Lord Alfred Hayes, Baron Von Raschke, and others. Joyce also has published many photos from her collection that you will not see anywhere else. Order today by email at joyce.postion@gmail.com. Payment is through PayPal. The book is only $20 plus $6 shipping and handling. International orders, please email Joyce for shipping charge. Folks, run, don't walk to your keyboard, and order today. And enjoy the podcast.
Yeah.
Internet.
Yeah. The real chronology of the thing, we should point out that Nick had actually been contacted by Vern Gagne and Wally Carbo even a couple years earlier than 1970. Vern had been around the business long enough where Warren was one of his idols, you may say. And of course they were friends. And Vern knew of Nick's abilities. Okay. Now let's just back up the truck a little bit. When Nick started in 1954, he did have the honor, which, a lot of these older wrestlers, they said this was an honor in hindsight when they got to team with their dads. And what Nick had a chance to do was, Warren's career was on the downside. It worked good for him because he could get into the tag team. And a lot of older wrestlers would get involved in tag teams because then they didn't have to do the whole workload. Another wrestler could carry more of the weight, and still the team could be over because of the name value of the seasoned veteran that, is kind of getting up there. So this was the case with Warren. And he had the chance to team with his son. And Nick always told me, he said, of all of the tag team partners and tag team matches that he ever had, he said it was such an honor for him to be in the ring with his dad. Now, you would hear Larry Hennig tell that story later on about his son Kurt and so on. And Vern, he said that about Greg later on, that it was such a thrill that Greg could team with his dad and vice versa. So Nick, though, a lot of the older or the younger fans, they don't realize that these guys didn't just start in the wrestling ring, get in the ring, have a match, and they were over. And they were getting a push, and they were going to be the world champion, and they were going to, take over the territory.
Yeah.
The vast majority of the guys of Nick's era, and let's just say that mid-50s through, let's go to 1970. A lot of the guys that started in the business during those years, they literally started in the business and then had to work their way up on cards around the country, maybe even travel the world a little bit, but definitely different territories where they would be in opening matches or mid-card, maybe semi-windups, but they were, as you want to say, learning the trade. It was very important for most promoters in those days to have the young wrestlers travel, gain experience, go out to a different territory, learn from other talent. You could bring that back home eventually. And that's what Nick did. Ironically, in those days, if a guy started in the business, it would usually be 5, maybe even as much as 10 years before they were now a bona fide star themselves and being a main eventer, and then going against some of those veterans that, could help put them over as well. It wasn't like it. And again, this isn't a knock on today's wrestling because it's a different product. But today, the guy goes to a training camp, wham, bam, you're in the business and you're the next big thing. You're on TV. And because you're built, 6'9.5", and you got muscles that span 2 cities, you're the next champion. The guys in the old era didn't have that ability. with but the rarest exceptions, Vern Gagne being one of them. He came out of the Olympics. He was an established star. He was given mega stardom right away because of those credentials. But a guy like Nick Bockwinkel had to earn his oats. So when he came here, and I threw out that date, December 10th of 1970, I throw that out because I literally, Brian, I remember it, honest to God, like it was, well, the day before yesterday. I was 1970. I had just turned 19 years old, a couple of months earlier. And here I'm watching All-Star Wrestling in my bedroom at home. It used to be on at 6 to 7:30 on Saturday nights. I'm watching it on my little black and white Zenith TV with the rabbit ears. And this new guy comes out. Marty is talking to, he has a match, a squash match on TV. He beat a jobber. But he comes out and he's talking to Marty. And, the thing about wrestling, and most fans will tell you this, is there's always a guy that they immediately like him or they immediately, ho hum, and the guy doesn't get over. So I'm watching TV and Nick is talking to Marty, and Nick is very soft-spoken, very low-key, just came out there and stood and, with his arms folded, and Marty asked him, Nick, I know you're a second-generation wrestler. Tell me a little bit about yourself. And Nick, not raising his voice at all, he just said, I've been wrestling for a number of years. I got training from my dad. I'm on my own. I've been chasing the world championship. And he said, quite honestly, Marty, the champion, Vern Gagne, has avoided me, I think. He has evaded me. When I've been in territories, he doesn't come in. So he said, I'm in Vern Gagne's backyard right here, Minneapolis. And I've come here to challenge. And the thing that got him over that was the way Nick finished that interview. He said to Marty, he said, Marty, in Hawaii, where I just came from, and I was the state champion, when someone is leaving Hawaii, we say aloha. And then he looked at the camera and he said, Vern Gagne, I'm here. I'm going to come after you. Aloha, Vern Gagne. And he just walked off. And Marty O'Neill, there he is, fans. New challenger, Nick Bockwinkel.
Yeah.
Now, I paraphrased the way he said that a little bit. I wished it was on tape because I was like, whoa, that was powerful.
Yeah.
I mean, he issued the challenge and then he said, Vern Gagne, you're leaving. When he was contacted by Vern and Wally to come in, as I said, it was actually as much as 2 years earlier. Logistically, it didn't work out. Nick was still fulfilling commitments in other territories. What happened with Nick, though, whether it was by design or whether it was by fate, whatever, Nick went to Georgia for wrestling in that territory in 1969, early 69. And for the first time in his career, he was wrestling as a heel. He had never done this before. He was always very popular babyface. And as I said earlier in his career, young Nicky Bockwinkel, the ladies' favorite, they used to call it. And he was, as clean cut, when we say the crew cut and everything, he was just clean cut, the kid, the boy next door look. So he was dabbling in the heel territory. And it was in Georgia for that year where he ended up becoming Georgia state champion. He ended up winning the Georgia tag team title for a little bit. But definitely he was working with guys in the business that were really helping him in the heel category. Guys like Paul DeMarco, who was a heck of a great heel. Buddy Colt, Ron Reed to some AWA fans, but Buddy was a top-notch heel right at that point in time. And one of the guys that worked a lot with Nick was a guy named Joe Hamilton, who was under the mask as the assassin, or one of the assassins at the time. There were two of them. Tom Ernesto being the other one. But Jody Hamilton worked a little bit with him. And for fans that heard Jody Hamilton over the years, he had a unique interview style where he could not really shout and rant and rave, but he could get his point across, and you believed him. If he said he was going to hurt you, you believed him. If he said he was going to hurt you, you wanted to see him beat so that he didn't, you know. That was the way Jody was. And so he was a good influence on Nick. Then it started to work out with coming to the AWA. So to answer your question, yes, Vern and Wally, especially Vern, had told Nick that he wanted him to kind of come in and be the heir apparent to the Vern Gagne Championship. Vern, by 1970, was still wrestling pretty much a full schedule, but his schedule was a lot less than it had been, you know, the previous year, 2, 3, 4, 5 before that, when he'd be wrestling, you know, 20 times a month or more, where now Vern was wrestling more, maybe once or twice or 3 times a month as champion. In 1970, he was still, what would he have been? Approaching, he was born in 26, 66. He's 40, he's about 45, 46 years old. Okay.
Yep.
And for a wrestler in that era, that was getting up there.
Yeah.
So, Vern definitely wanted Nick to come in and be the eventual AWA champion. Now, Nick said there was never a date set or an exact time, but he did tell me that Vern had talked about maybe sometime in 71 or 72.
Okay.
So that was the plan. And it was a matter of building up that program. Now, here's where you can kind of assume that it probably was in the books to happen. From the time that Nick debuted in the AWA in December of 70, and his first couple of matches, he had a couple in December, but his actual first start was 71 going forward, okay? Well, we had a guy named Hercules Cortez here who had come back after a decade of not being here. He was very popular. They had hooked him up with Red Bastien. They became the tag team champions. And the reason they became champs was because the Vachon brothers, after pretty close to 3 years, just shy of 3 years, they had informed Vern they wanted to give up the title because they were going to go and promote in the Montreal area for Grand Prix Wrestling, which Paul Vachon was becoming one of the partners in the organization. Yeah. So they gave Vern their notice that they'd like to drop the title. Well, Vern had Cortez and Bastien, very popular, very over. Bastien was a hometown boy. He was from Minneapolis. He had returned home a couple of years earlier. It was kind of his home, although he did have a home in Texas. And that'll be good for later on when we go there. So he had Cortez and Bastien take the title from the Vachons. Now, Vern's intent with that move was to have Cortez and Bastien basically hold the title for a year or two, depending. Yeah. Because in that era, it was unusual where they'd put the title on someone and then flip it, and flip it and flip it and flip it. So Cortez and Bastien were going to be the champs. Now, also what happened was with Cortez is that he was in a singles situation match. He was undefeated around the AWA, and especially in Minneapolis. He hadn't suffered a singles defeat. So in July of 71, July 24th to be exact, Cortez and Bockwinkel were signed to a Battle of the Unbeatens. And up to that point, Nick had been undefeated. They pretty much ran this match around the circuit. We were the very last one to get it. Battle of the Unbeatens. The rationale was, and the buildup was, is that these two top undefeated challengers, the winner of the Battle of the Unbeatens, would be in line for a title match with Vern Gagne. That was the buildup. Well, it was pretty safe to say that Cortez wasn't going to get a shot at Nick or at Vern, I'm sorry. He wasn't going to get a shot because he was a baby face and he co-held the tag team title at the time. So the assumption would be that Nick was going to go over Cortez and further that getting closer to Vern Gagne match, when it would take place. On the early morning hours of July 24th, while coming back from Winnipeg, Canada, and Nick and Cortez had wrestled on that Duluth or Winnipeg card, not Duluth, Winnipeg card. Driving back wee hours of the morning to come to Minneapolis for the July 24th night card, we are now, so well aware that there was a tragic car accident. Cortez lost control of the car. Stories say he fell asleep at the wheel. Car went off the road, rolled. Cortez, according to the one report I had, he was actually thrown from the car and he was killed. He died. Bastien was in the front seat. He got pushed onto the floor of the front seat, banged up his leg really bad in doing this. And then that night, of course, that morning, we get the news that the wrestler was killed. This is big news because tonight we have a wrestling card. What are we going to do? So All Star Wrestling comes on TV, and it was live because they used to do them live before the house show. And that's the opening that we get on the program. Fans, Hercules Cortez, tragically killed. And the AWA has announced that Vern Gagne has agreed to wrestle as a last-minute replacement to wrestle Nick. However, the title would not be on the line. And as Vern came out and said, offering his condolences to the Cortez family and the fans, that, I'm doing this because we do have the card, but I haven't had time to prepare for Nick Bockwinkel as a challenger, and we will have the card. For a fan standpoint, this was great. I mean, you couldn't have come up with a better replacement, short of maybe the Crusher at the time, to be the solid replacement. But playing it off of the way they did, that, I'm not going to defend the title to him. So that night, it was Vern in a non-title match. Now, on that same card, it was also, ironically in hindsight, the AWA debut of Ray Stevens, who anybody who was even any type of wrestling fan could learn from the national newsstand magazines was a huge star. So Ray was one of those guys that, he had a reputation coming in. You heard about him in California. He ruled the Cow Palace, and he was, a zillion-time United States champion out there. He had tag team championships with various guys. So he was on the card. And coincidentally, he was going to wrestle Red Bastien that night. Well, Bastien also did not wrestle because of that knee or the leg injury, and they put in a substitute. But here's what happened in the main event. Nick and Vern come into the ring, do the introductions. Ray Stevens comes up to the ringside corner post area, and he sets a chair down. And he told the announcer, Marty O'Neill, that he was here, this was his debut, and he was here to scout both these wrestlers because he was here to win the world title, that it was his time as well, and he was going to scout them both. So he's at ringside in a chair. During the course of the match, Nick was in a sleeper hold that Vern put on.
Yep.
And, we always had the fun story, the background story, that the sleeper was a chokehold. All the heels, he's choking him. He's just that little slip of the arm and it's off the carotid artery and he's choking. So he's got the sleeper hold on Nick. Stevens stands up and starts pointing to referee Aldo Bagni, who was an old pro wrestler himself, who had kind of pretty much semi-retired. Big old dude, crusty looking old son of a gun too, but he was the special referee. You had to see a picture of Aldo Bagni. His only claim to fame was, by his own recognition, was that he was the North Dakota state champion, and I've never been able to prove that. But anyway, so Stevens is in Bogny's face that he's choking him. Vern is choking him, and Bogny, like was doing the referee's best to not understand what he was saying. So Stevens got up on the ring apron to point to him. He's choking him. Vern, now in hindsight, why would the world champion do this? Let go of a finishing hold, but he let go of Nick, and he went over and he popped Stevens, who fell down onto the ringside floor. Well, you know what, guys? This gave Nick just that nanosecond he needed to recuperate from all the grogginess. And he comes up behind Vern, rolls him over into a cradle, and all of a sudden Aldo Bogny came to, and 1, 2, 3, and Vern Gagne was pinned. And then afterwards, we've got the story now that I beat Vern Gagne. Now you can't ignore me, Vern Gagne. This is Nick's version of the story.
Yeah.
But Vern had a whole nother dilemma because this Cortez thing changed history.
Mm-hmm.
Remember Cortez and Bastien, the thought was they'd be champs for a couple of years.
Right.
Well, program's subject to change because now Cortez is gone. And Vern, he has to come up with what he's going to do with the tag team title behind the scenes.
Yeah.
In wrestling, there's various ways they've done it in the past. The guy was injured, so we take the title off him. We hold a tournament, all kinds of junk that goes on. But it came down that the AWA, and Vern was smart and realized that in order to replace the popular Cortez, he had to have a popular partner.
Yeah.
So he did what he usually did in a time like this. Vern contacted Reggie Lisowski, the Crusher. And he said, I need you to do me a favor. I want you to join Bastien. We put the title on you guys and Reggie immediately said, I'll do it. But this isn't long term. I don't want, and I've said this before, Crusher did not want, nor did he need a title to be over. So as many times as he had belts, they were always short term because he just did it for a favor or a special thing, special rematch, whatever it was. And he told Vern, yeah, I'll do it, but this has got to be short term. Bastien took maybe 3, 4, 5 weeks off to get his leg back in shape. Then he was scheduled to go to Japan in September with Hercules Cortez. There was a tour scheduled, and they were going to go over there as AWA Tag Team Champions. Well, that too fell apart. Well, Crusher wasn't going to go to Japan. He had told Vern he's not doing it. And Vern put Billy Howard, who sadly just passed away just a week or so back. Billy Howard was a journeyman wrestler here in the AWA, was a Central States wrestler, gained some success under a couple of names. He went over as Cortez's replacement. And he and Bastien, during the tour of Japan, during the month of September, they actually won the IWA tag team title for a 1-week period. They used to do that when the Americans would come over, wrestle against the Japanese. They'd switch a title or something. And so Red and Billy Howard, they held the title over there. And then when Red came back, it was announced that he and Crusher, Stanley Blackburn, has made the decision that Red could choose a partner of his choice. And Red made the comment that, I've looked over the talent, I've looked over all the wrestlers, and I don't think there's anybody that could replace the power and the popularity of Hercules and I as the Crusher. And there you had your team. So here's where the dilemma comes in. Now Vern has got Reggie telling him, I'm not going to do long-term tag team champion. And Vern realized that this Nick and Ray combination, this could work because Ray kind of played a part in that non-title bout. So what happened was he had them hooked up a little bit. They started going over really well with the fans. Vern realized that he could still wrestle less, maintain the title, but if he had a great team on top, and Larry Hennig and Lars Anderson were also top challengers at that time, but they had already been a team for almost 2 years at that point, and they just weren't going to be believable at that time as tag team champions. Okay. So nothing against Lars Anderson and Larry Hennig at that point, because they were great together. Yeah. So anyway, Nick and Ray kind of got the nod, and Vern put the title on Nick and Ray in January of '73. So just about 4 months after Crusher and Bastien were awarded the title, and he got Crusher away from it like Crusher wanted. Bastien then very shook up, and I will tell you this, excuse me. I had a chance on more than one occasion to talk with Red about that car accident. And Red told me that took so much out of him, that to lose, he and Cortez had been friends for over a decade or more in the business. And they had actually even teamed very briefly a decade earlier out in California, briefly, but they were good friends. And he said it just took so much out of him, and Red told me, he says it really brought home to him the constant enemy that traveling on the road was, because these guys did a lot of traveling from town to town, to get from this place to that place. And the fact that there weren't more accidents or more injuries or more deaths, probably in hindsight was a miracle, because these guys, they traveled too. I mean, they'd be doing 100 miles an hour to get to the next town. So Red told me that really was devastating for him. And he ended up giving Vern his notice. He said, when we dropped the title to Bockwinkel and Stevens, he was going to leave the AWA for a while. And he did. He went down to Texas. He had a home down there, which is what I brought up a moment ago. Mm-hmm. And he landed in Texas. And if you look at Texas programs from Dallas, Fort Worth, and Houston, he landed as a main eventer, and he was off and running down there as a single star for quite some time, for the year of '73 into '74. And he was able to be close to home at the time, but he got over really well down there. So that's how all that came about. And then Vern could just, wrestle less. So I hope I answered your question again.
You did. No, you did. Let's talk about the big day when finally Bockwinkel won the title from Vern in Vern's hometown, Minneapolis, Minnesota, November of '75. I believe it was November 8th. That's
November 8th, 1975, St. Paul Auditorium.
Were you there?
I was sitting ringside.
Tell us that your perspective. You were a young man. What was that like for you when that actually occurred and you were there live?
Hello, everyone. This is Brian Ferguson, the host of Bumps and Thumps, the talk of wrestling. I want to tell you about a new podcast out called Falls Count Anywhere. It is a classic pro wrestling podcast that brings you the legends of wrestling with true wrestling fans Chris DiCarlo and Charlie Turner. They bring on guests that are legends in this business, as well as wrestlers of today, promoters, referees, you name it. They have them on there, folks, and I encourage you to listen to them. If you're on YouTube, watch them. They drop every Saturday. They have their podcast. They drop it in the afternoon. So look forward to that podcast coming out. Falls Count Anywhere podcast with Chris DiCarlo and Charlie Turner. Folks, you will not be disappointed. I guarantee it. And enjoy the podcast.
Tell us.
I will tell you that after that initial non-title bout, there were a couple of other non-title victories over Vern that Nick had attained, which added to the drama that I've now beaten him 4 times. I've beaten him 5 times. We got to have the title match. that night, I had never given thought to the fact that maybe this was the night. I honestly didn't. I wasn't in the know, but I never gave it any thought that this was going to be the night. And here was what was weird about that night. Bobby Heenan, who had been managing Nick for a few months before this now, because Bobby had taken over the tag team of Ray Stevens and Nick Bockwinkel in July of 74 as their manager. And then they held the title until 75, or the end of 70. It was in 75. They ended up losing to Crusher and Bruiser. And Stevens left the territory, and Bobby was managing Nick alone. So they were kind of getting to that singles push. But weird, on that night, Bobby Heenan was not in the building. He wasn't there to manage Nick that night. Bobby Duncombe had come out as Nick's second for the night. And Bobby Duncombe at that point in time had been here a short time, but he was it was boasted that he was being a policeman for Nick. That, you know, if you wanted a chance to get at Nick, you had to go through Bobby first, that sort of thing. So Bobby Duncombe come out as his second. Well, Vern came out with Greg as his second. Okay. And both were in their regular clothes. And the special referee for the night, and it wasn't announced as a special referee, he'd just been in the business for a short time at that point in time. It was Paul Pershman, who later on we know became known as Playboy Buddy Rose, the lean, mean 217-pound Buddy Rose.
Yes.
Anyway, but he was Paul Pershman. He had only been wrestling himself for a short time. Vern used to have his rookies referee some matches. That also gave them insight into how the matches work between the two guys. So that's what Paul was doing. And so Paul ended up being the referee. Now, during the course of the match, Bobby Duncombe did get his nose in it a little bit. Vern was pinned, and Nick was the new champ. We went away that night. It was just weird. And I remember thinking, you know, this is going to be one of those things where somehow Stanley Blackburn viewed the tapes that God only knows where those tapes were, because there were never any cameras, you know. But, well, Stanley always had the unique ability to view tapes. But we figured it'd be a reverse decision or something because of the interference or whatever. And that Paul Pershman, you know, didn't see the interference. And we figured it was going to be that way. It wasn't. It was for real. Yeah. And Nick was, I just can't tell you what a great champion he was. Yeah. He did something that most wrestlers in that era were not even doing anymore. But he learned it from his dad. He learned it from Lou Thez. And Vern Gagne did this as well. Even though Nick was a heel, when he walked into a building, when he was out doing an interview and it was a non-wrestling night thing, he'd have the suit, a tie, or a very nice sport coat and a nice shirt. He'd be decked out and he'd have the rings on. And he always gave you that persona that he was the champion. And as he said, it was what Lou Thez had taught him, that if you're the world heavyweight champion, you should look the part. And, you know, again, today you match it today's wrestlers, you know, with the different wrestlers that have been champion. I mean, God only knows they got the weirdest outfits and, they don't look a champion at all, but they're the champion. So Nick was the last of an era. Harley Race did that too. Whenever you saw Harley Race, he had the suit, the sport coat, the professional look, and that was important. And that's the way the NWA touted their champions in the day. And Vern and Nick obviously did that as well.
Yeah. I got to tell you, Nick, great heel, because I could not stand that man when I was a kid as world champion. He would always, back then I thought skate by, interference, nobody saw nothing conveniently, all this stuff. They did it so well. And I want to talk about, if we could, he was champion 4 times. One time for a reign of 5 years, unheard of. Nowadays, you don't see a champ. But I want to talk about a wrestler in particular that came to the AWA in the early 80s uh, that Bockwinkel, in my opinion, got put this guy over so much, and that's Hulk Hogan. Hulk Hogan wasn't a well-known wrestler until he came to the AWA. I never heard of him. Talk about that persona a little bit. How that all kind of how Nick put him over, and we can talk about the title and stuff and all that. But just talk about that a little bit, would you, George?
Well, you have to look at Nick Bockwinkel first of all. He was everything you said he was when you said he made you hate him with his arrogance. He delivered an interview that wasn't unlike any other heel at the time. He didn't spit and shower the TV announcer with spit, and he didn't yell and scream and call names. He was very low key, very sophisticated, used words that a lot of people didn't even understand. We used to laugh, they'd have to run to get the dictionary. Look at what was that he said just now, and Nick would, purposely come out with a word or two. He did this on purpose, but his interview process was so good. And then the fact when he's champion that, yes, the referee always played such a good part where he missed something that the fans saw, but the referee didn't. And somehow the champion would squeeze by and keep the title. And of course, that builds matches and rematches and challengers. So when you get to the Hogan thing, Hogan was a guy, when he first came here, he had been in the business for, oh boy, without looking, I think he maybe started wrestling around 77, 78 here and there. He had a couple of different names, Sterling Golden, but he wasn't going anywhere. He was horrible on the microphone. And there's a YouTube video out there where Johnny Valiant was his manager, his mouthpiece. Vern wanted Hogan to be a heel originally. Yeah. Brought him in, and Hogan couldn't put a sentence together. If you watch this interview on YouTube, you can see that Hogan, he actually has his back to the fans as he's on the interview. But he can't put a sentence together, and they got Johnny's gift of gab to get him over. So Vern and Nick and Bobby Heenan especially, a lot of people don't know this. They worked with Hogan to get his interview style over when Vern realized he was going to be a popular star. The fan base was changing by that time in 1980, Brian. And the fans were more enamored with the size and the look of Hulk Hogan. He had come off of the Rocky movie theme with Thunder Lips. He played in the movie, the Rocky movie. And he was bigger than life. This tanned, golden, blonde-haired, powerful-looking dude. That was the new baby face. So against a guy like Nick Bockwinkel, your fans say, he could beat him. He should have. You got to remember that Nick was a genius at making another wrestler look good. That was part of sometimes being the champion of any organization. Harley Race could do that. They could make that challenger look better than they were, and that was the objective, to put them over, make it appear that you were on the verge of losing the belt, that you were beaten beyond words, and somehow you snuck in there and won it. Yeah. So Hogan was the perfect challenger, because there wasn't a fan in any AWA arena that didn't go to that arena and come home from that arena believing that Hulk Hogan was the better wrestler and he should be champion. So now all the fans out there, and this has been going on for, good Lord, almost 4 decades now. Vern Gagne should have put the title on Hulk Hogan.
Yes.
And then the AWA would have been saved, and Vince McMahon wouldn't have come in, and we wouldn't have, that's all hindsight. It's all speculation. It's all, maybe, whatever. But here's the truth. Vern was drawing sellout crowds with Nick Bockwinkel as the world champion for, at this point in time, 5, 6 years.
Yeah.
And Bobby Heenan, the perfect manager. What a combo. There's no greater manager wrestler combination ever.
Yeah. Agree.
And so Vern was making money with that. Hogan was the perfect challenger that fans believed should have won it. And that's what you wanted your fans to go home with.
Yeah.
He got ripped off. Bockwinkel cheated. Heenan cheated. That's what brought the money in. And Hogan's going to get a rematch. That's the way wrestling was promoted. So all of those fans out there who said, well, Vern should have put the title on Hogan, and Hogan wasn't drawing all entirely. Yeah, he was a draw, but Hogan was drawing because Bockwinkel made him look so good.
He did. I will say I was one of those when I was a kid that he got ripped off, Hogan, this and that. And now that, years later, I'm older, more knowledgeable about the profession and the craft. And you look back and really Bockwinkel made Hogan, in my opinion. He made Hogan. Like you said, he was kind of a journeyman before Rocky 3, got him kind of going again with his looks and people knowing who he was. And he went to the AWA. And Vern, I don't think gets enough credit either. He spots talent. He knows how to use them and their capacities and their capabilities. And Hogan, if he wasn't in the AWA and got all that exposure, if you will, it could be an entirely different outlook. If Vern had just made him a mid-carder because he was so big and beating up people all the time. But to me, Bockwinkel and Gagne made him, and the rest is history, obviously. But Bockwinkel, to me, 4-time champion. Last great match to me was the Curt Hennig, Nick Bockwinkel match at the Cow Palace in 87.
87.
May 2nd at the Cow Palace.
Yeah, 87.
One of the best matches I've ever seen, honestly.
And I would agree with you on that. I've watched that match, and I've watched it more than once. And I think nothing is a testament to Nick Bockwinkel more than the fact that in 1987, this was when Nick decided himself that he needed to sort of walk away from the ring. He decided that he wanted to go out when he was still good. Nick said that. He said, I had aches and pains and different things, and I could still go out there and perform with the best of them. And Curt Hennig was the perfect example. Perfect, no pun intended. But he was the perfect example of why Nick was so good. Because when you see Nick wrestle Curt in that match, Nick was 20 some years older than Curt.
Yeah.
And he didn't carry Curt because Curt, he was good.
Yeah.
But between the two of them, the wily veteran and the young rookie at that point in time, they put on a clinic that is for the ages.
Yeah.
And if nothing says Nick's greatness, and with that, he pretty much walked away.
Yeah.
He said, I am done. After 33 years, almost 34 years in the business, because he had started in 54. And he walked away as active competitor. Now, he had a couple of little exhibitions later on in some old-timers battle rumbles, etc. But he was done. And we all know how good Curt was. So that's a testament to Nick Bockwinkel. I only want to say this, and I know we're getting near the end here.
Yep.
Is that as a fan, watching wrestling for all the decades that I have, and I take with great pride the friendships that I've had with so many of the wrestlers. And I have my favorites. Nick Bockwinkel is on my list of favorites. It's a small list of really close favorites, and Nick is on it. The fact that he trusted me, the fact that he confided in me later on, the fact that he would call me, he would talk with me, and we'd do this. And then I sadly saw the later years decline of his mind because of Alzheimer's, of which his dad died of, by the way. And Nick always told me how rough that was. But we saw Nick at the end where it was evident that Nick didn't know anymore. He wasn't the Nick Bockwinkel that we knew, and it was over. Shortly before he passed away, he had said goodbye to Cauliflower Alley. And it was announced by Darlene, his wife, that this was going to be his last appearance there. Mm-hmm. And I will tell you that I've made comment to this before, getting the Christmas cards from him, getting the Christmas phone calls, and getting those random phone calls where we could talk for an hour. And when I got the word that Nick had died, I legitimately, I'm not ashamed to say this, it was a Sunday morning. I got the news. I had real tears in my eyes. This was early in the morning on a Sunday that I got the news. And Lorraine asked me, she said, "What's wrong?" And I told her, I said, "Nick died." And even as I say that, I still, I remember. Emotional. He was just a special person and a credit to our business. And again, I go back to what we started with. Any youngster out there, any wannabe wrestler, any new wrestler that has any aspirations to be anybody in this business, if you don't go and look at the tapes of Nick Bockwinkel and a lot of his peers, you don't go and look at those tapes and seriously try to learn from them, you're a fool. You're a fool. And you will never, ever be as great as you might be if you just take it. Don't look at it and say, well, they were old. That was then. This now they don't know anything. And I've heard young wrestlers say that. Oh, those guys, they're a bunch of old guys, you know. Boy, I'll tell you what, you're just you're not smart. So there you go. Nick Bockwinkel, in my opinion, and I think you share it with me, one of the greatest professional wrestlers ever. And if he isn't on a list of all-time greats and on that list near the top, then the list is bogus, kids. The list doesn't mean anything. If you're going to put guys like some of these newbies that are out there, I don't care who they are, you know, your Rob Van Dams and anybody else, you're going to put them above Nick Bockwinkel, you're delusional. You just are. Not saying they're not good, but you're delusional. Nick Bockwinkel, God bless you. I am blessed to have had your friendship, and I am so glad that we can continue to talk about you and share your accolades. And we could go on for hours. So thank you for you suggested this topic, and I had no problem saying 100%. Let's do it.
Well, I appreciate it. You know, like I said, and we'll get off here in just a minute, but Nick, to me, does not get the accolades that he deserves, and there's others too, but today we're talking about the great one, in my opinion, Nick Bockwinkel. George Schire, thank you for coming on today, sir. I really appreciate it and always enjoy your insight and knowledge. Appreciate it, sir.
Thank you, Brian. Always keep Bumps and Thumps as a favorite.
Yes, the t-shirts. Yes.
Are there.
And folks, if you're watching, thank you. If you're listening, thank you. And if you haven't subscribed, please do so. And we will talk to you